Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Music, Money, and Life podcast. This podcast, as always, is brought to you by howtolicenseyourmusic.com. If you're interested in learning how to make money licensing your music into television shows, video games, commercials, advertisements, and more, visit howtolicenseyourmusic.com. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Music, Money, and Life podcast. Today, I have with me Lisa Klein Moberly from a company called Optic Noise. And you're based out of LA, right, Lisa?
I am. I spent quite a few years in San Francisco and finally made it down to LA, which I'm quite happy to be here.
Excellent. How long have you been in LA?
I've been in LA for several years now, but even in San Francisco, I made regular trips down here because obviously that's where the business is. So
Right. Cool. And how long have you been running Optic Noise? When was the company founded?
I started Optic Noise I started doing this in 2001, believe it or not. So when I started, it was me and maybe a handful of other agents. It was a wide open world when I started doing this. And previous to that, I had a big background in artist management as well. So I had a good catalog to pull from right from the start, and the contacts as well. Since a lot of the label people and the publishers that I would work with actually changed their careers and became music supervisors. So it was kind of a big shift all the way around.
Well, let's do this, Lisa. I am, relatively familiar with what you do at Optic Noise, but for those that are listening that are not, can you kind of give us a little bit of an idea about the types of placements you do and the types of artists that you work with?
Yes. Well, I generally, as a rule, always as a rule, like to work with music I know and like. So my catalog generally centers on indie rock and pop. I've got a lot of good singer-songwriters, and also I've got a handful of New Orleans artists that I've been growing as well, because I'm a big fan of New Orleans, and New Orleans is near and dear to my heart, so I like that side of things as well. So even though it's kind of eclectic, it's actually very niche-oriented as well. And that's kind of what I stick with, and that's what I know, and that's what people know me for.
That's interesting.
For what I represent.
And do you work with those styles primarily, like you said, because you like those styles, or do you find that those particular styles are more in demand for placement?
Well, they are, and there are certain styles that are popular. But I do like to work with the specific genres that I know well, because there is so much subtlety. So if a hip-hop artist came to me and gave me some music, I don't have enough background in hip-hop to be able to know what's good and what's fantastic. And I also don't know if someone is looking for more of a Dr. Dre style. I wouldn't know how to distinguish that between any other style. Whereas the music that I do know is they wanted something that sounded like Sonic Youth versus, say, something more modern, but in that same style. I would know the subtleties and be able to pitch much, much better.
That
in that regard.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
How big is your roster? How many artists do you work with?
I work with, at any given time, I would say probably about 250 to 300 artists, which seems like a lot, but believe it or not, it's everything that I can keep in my head.
Yeah.
And many of my artists I've worked with literally since the inception of Optic Noise. So these are artists that we've worked together for years and years and years. So I'm very familiar with their catalog, and I will take on new artists gradually, but not certainly massively. I'm very, very selective in what I bring in.
Yeah, no, that actually seems relatively small. I mean, I've talked to other companies that have, 1,000 plus, upwards of 2,000 artists sometimes, which just seems like an overwhelming amount of music to me. I think it's cool that you have a relatively small catalog. Are you really sort of hands-on with your artists? I know you said some of them you've had long relationships with. How closely do you work with most of the artists that you have on your roster?
Well, yeah, that's part of it, is that I like to work. As I said, I was a band manager
Yeah.
for years, and that's part of why I love doing what I do, is I do like working very closely with my artists. So there's artists that will send me their demos and say, hey, what do you think of this? And I'll say, change this, or it needs this. Or, they'll come to me separately and say, hey, I have this, agreement for this label that wants to sign me. Will you look it over?
Yeah.
So in a way, I do kind of take an arm's approach of management to my bands too. And I do like working with them and knowing what's going on. And part of it, the way I like that and establishing a long-term relationship with them, is my approach to pitching is to develop those artists in front of the music supervisors as well. So I will repeatedly send out different songs from each artist to all my music supervisors, so that they're begin to get familiar with these artists, because a lot of them are indie artists,
Right.
and they're not going to be discovered anywhere else. So pretty soon they'll become familiar with those artists and say, oh, that art be good for this scene.
Right.
So I'll look at the catalog for this artist. So that'll help them come to mind too. And that's actually worked. I've had music supervisors actually sing me entire songs of bands that no one's ever heard of outside their hometown.
Yeah.
Because I sent them on a comp. So, and I love that. I love when that happens.
Cool. Interesting. And how important, Lisa, do you feel like it is? I've been interviewing a lot of different types of companies and different types of people working in the licensing industry. How important do you feel like it is that artists are somewhat known? Like you said, most of your artists are indie artists, but are you finding that it's important? Like, in other words, how big of a factor is how established you are as an artist in terms of landing, ultimately landing placements?
Well, it's becoming more and more of a factor. And I think when music supervisors select music, a lot of people aren't aware that once they select something, that has to be vetted by the director and the editor and whoever else has an input in that particular scene for that music. So, and it goes back and forth too. A music supervisor will bring music to the director, but a lot of times it'll come from the other side. So the director will say, oh, I want something cool like such and such. So it'll be something that they know.
Yeah.
So that's one level of it. And the other is that particularly for the larger shows and the larger network shows, and particularly the HBO shows for that matter as well, they like to be known as breaking bands or introducing bands. So that's part of it too. And that is getting easier and easier to place and negotiate for those bands up and coming, whereas, maybe 10 years ago, it was a little more difficult. So I always tell my artists, too, the competition is huge. It really is. But I also tell them that good rises to the top. So in the end, music supervisors, and I say this across the board, love music. And they love nothing more than helping an independent artist make some money and get them a cool placement when they can. So when something is great, it'll find its way, through the system. So there is always that. It's always the right place at the right time.
Yeah, that's really encouraging to hear. I mean, I work with a lot of artists that I think are attracted to licensing because they don't necessarily want to tour. Maybe they're a little bit older, or they're just sort of burnt out on being on the road and trying to carve out a career as a performing artist. Do you think it's enough that if you just write amazing songs and you're in Nebraska or something, but you have really good songs and they're produced really well, is that enough to land, high profile placements?
Well, I think it can be. And as I said, it is getting more and more competitive, and there is a shift in wanting very active artists that are very active on the radio and on tour. But as I said, if it's the right song at the right time, that is possible. And also, I frankly often have kind of a soft heart for artists who have kind of been through the mill and have been touring, and all they want to do is write songs. So, and I also think if you've been through that slog and you still want to write music, then you are a real musician. And that is to be quality stuff.
That's really interesting to hear you say that. I signed with a new sync agency recently, and I'm 42, and I've been writing music for 20 plus years. I've been at this a long time. But I had this conference call with this particular company, and they said one of the reasons they were attracted to me is they were like, we like the fact that you've been doing this for a long time, and that says to us that you're very serious about this. You're not, just in this for a quick buck. So that's kind of cool to hear you reiterate that same idea. Let me ask you this question. So there's sort of a series of questions that I've been asking everybody that I'm bringing on this podcast. And one of the questions is the idea of pursuing licensing as a career. And I know you've alluded to the fact that the industry has changed a lot over the years. Do you think this is a viable career path to make money from, like a full-time income from?
Well, I think that can be answered the same way as, do you think being a movie star is a viable career path?
Yeah.
It can be.
Right.
People do it. But there's a lot of people who are the extras, or they're the ones that write the script. So there's spaces in the music licensing world. But I think just as being in a band and wanting to make it big, you have to work, which means you do have to get in a horrible, stinky van and tour and play for two people in Des Moines. The same is with licensing. It takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of writing. It takes a lot of dedication and patience. So the artists that I work with that do make a living off of licensing have their hands in a lot of different areas.
Yeah.
So they are in bands, and they write their own indie music. Then they do their solo stuff, which also is licensed. They also write music for libraries when they get paid to do that. So they will turn out, boogie-woogie instrumentals, and then next week they'll do some blues stuff. So they're constantly doing that. What I will say to any artist that's serious in any level is to get your publishing and writing in order. Make sure all your co-writing splits are correct, your publishing is registered with BMI or ASCAP or CSAC, and make sure all of that is in order and accessible, because the back-end income, particularly from licensing, is just as important as the front-end licensing fees. And if you're successful and you're good and you do get licenses, you can make a good amount of money from the back end. So I think that's very important, and I think that's what a lot of artists overlook.
Yeah, no, that's good advice. Can you talk a little bit actually about co-writing splits? Because that's a question I get from time to time, and I don't really have co-writers. I just write my own material, so it's not something I've really done. How has that typically worked out? It's sort of worked out between the writers initially in terms of what they feel is a fair split, right?
Correct. So there's two parts to life, to writing and to publishing. So when a writer creates a work, they own the publishing to that. Such as though you're the writer of their song and you own the publishing. So, but the publishing and the writer are two different entities. So the most equitable part, if a writer writes a song with another writer, let's say they can split it any way they want. I represent a song where there are two co-writers on it, and my writer owns 83.33% of that song.
It's an interesting breakdown.
Yeah. So you can split it any way you want, but a lot of times it's equitable and you split it 50-50.
Yeah.
So each writer owns a portion of the publishing as well. So that's where I think writers and musicians get messed up, is the publishing side. You can register just as a writer, and your residuals, your back-end royalties will go through your writer's share. But I also think it's good to register as a publisher. So each writer can own their own publishing and split it that way, which is, I think, the also fair and equitable part. But what I also like about the publishing is that it gives you more information, I think, about what is coming in and what things look like. But also, it's where music supervisors go to look to see who the contact is for those songs, which you're not going to get on your writer's side. So, for example, let's say I'm a music supervisor and I wanted to find this song that I heard on the radio. So who do I call? Who owns the publishing to that?
Yeah.
Well, the first thing I'll do is go to BMI or ASCAP or CSAC and look for that song. And if it's registered to a publisher, you have the opportunity to put in your contact info, your email address, your phone number. So that's important too.
Yeah.
So those two things are important.
Okay. Yeah. No, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, and that again ties into making. If you want to make a living in the music business and in licensing, you need to take a business approach to it as well, and get everything in order. Because that's the also another important thing. If those splits, if you do have a co-writer, or there's a debate about the percentage, music supervisors will not want to license it because they don't want to get sued. The network doesn't want to get sued. They need to guarantee that the people who own those songs really do own those songs.
Yeah, that's something that I've been talking about with my producer recently, and he was sort of alluding to the idea, and maybe you can tell me if this is correct, but the idea that one of the reasons supervisors really prefer to work with more established artists is that it's just there's less of a risk in terms of the song not actually being their song. Is that kind of part of it too?
Well, it is a part. Well, there's also something that I'll get into briefly, and it's called retitling.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Sure, absolutely.
But there are other companies out there that say, we want to work with you on a non-exclusive basis, and if we play something, then we're going to call your song another title. It'll be the exact same song, but we're going to take the publishing from that.
Right.
Once we call it something else.
Right.
So that means that it really is the exact same song. The publisher or the agency that gets the publishing doesn't have to pay anything for it. It's not like a regular publishing deal. But the minute that artist wants to do something exclusive, if they have a commercial that is exclusive of all other, whatever the commercial is selling. For example, if it's a car commercial, they want you to be exclusive. They don't want you to compete. They don't want to compete with another car. So, but if that agency that's retitled is non-exclusive,
Mm-hmm.
that writer has no control over that song. So music supervisors are very wary of that part of it as well. And I also suspect there are a lot of agents, too, that just haven't learned how to vet the music and the copyright of songs. They're just starting out, and so they haven't learned to grill artists or recognize covers, for that matter.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people, I think, that just aren't familiar with the, entire catalog, so they wouldn't know if something is a cover just because it's, before their time.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of things that happen in terms of vetting.
You're bringing up a really interesting point, and it's something that I've struggled with a little bit. So the idea of retitling, I guess it really touches on, whether you should sign exclusively with someone versus non-exclusively. And correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't really the only way to do a non-exclusive publishing deal, don't you sort of have to retitle? Because when you register your titles with ASCAP or BMI, you can really only attach one publisher at a time to each title. So how do you deal with that?
Right. That's why.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, that's why they retitle it, so they just put it under a different name.
Yeah. But what?
And I don't. I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry. I think we have a slight delay. I don't mean to cut you off. I was just going to ask, how do you suggest writers deal with this sort of issue of, should you go exclusive? Should you wait for just the right company? How should you approach that from a songwriter's perspective?
Well, non-exclusive doesn't mean retitling. That doesn't necessarily mean that at all. However, I always tell artists that they really should go exclusive. Even if they don't go with me, they should go exclusive with someone else. Because if supervisors see it being pitched from more than one place, they do get suspicious of the ownership of it. And it also becomes political. Like, if two companies that they know are pitching it and they choose it, what company do they go to?
Yeah.
They don't want to have that hassle. They do begin to worry about the ownership of the song. And in my opinion, too, I think it kind of lessens the worth of the track, frankly, if they see it come in from all over the place and they think, oh, everyone has this. It's not special.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of reasons. And also, there are times when I will work with artists. I do work with my artists exclusively, but there are times I'll let them work with another agency that is in kind of a different world. So maybe they'll be pitching, another agency will be pitching to, music videographers for weddings or something that I don't even touch. Because I do like to allow my artists to make as much money as possible. But, excuse me, I'm just getting over a cold, so please do.
No problem.
So there are exceptions, I think, but in the general scheme of things, I think exclusivity is very important. And music supervisors have told me, too, that they don't want to work with anyone that isn't exclusive.
Yeah.
That doesn't have artists.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. And everything you're saying makes sense to me. It just seems like a real catch-22 for artists. And I've sort of found myself in this dilemma as well, where I've signed both types of deals. And I've had good luck with some of the songs I've signed exclusively, and I have others that, to this day that are just sitting with this one particular publisher that I feel like these particular tracks are really, really strong, but for whatever reason they haven't been placed yet. So I guess, from the artist perspective, we're obviously trying to make as much money as possible. So it seems like a bit of a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of situation.
It is, and I think, it's not a perfect science, certainly. Yeah. And it's just like the rest of the world. Sometimes you get really lucky, and sometimes you just make a bad mistake, and it's kind of, you just got to learn from that. So there is going to be those scenarios as well. But I also think it depends on what kind of music that you're making. If you are making library music and their instrumental bumpers and little outros and intros, I think non-exclusive is fine because those libraries that represent that stuff have vetted the music, and I think that is less of an issue. But if you are a really cool indie band or a serious roots artist, I think that is more of an issue. So my advice, I think, for vetting agencies is kind of almost the same way I suggest to artists for vetting publicists, is just go to the agency site and look at those artists, and then kind of Google those artists and see where they've been placed, or look at their roster. And if there's a huge list, at least you know that company is a working company. If they're just kind of an MTV logo on the front of their site, then you think, well, maybe they're just starting out and they're not going to be as effective. So you can do some sleuthing before you make a decision on that as well.
Yeah, no.
But as I tell my artists too, and I always warn them, it's never regular and it's never constant. It is a lot of competition, and it is always at the right place at the right time. So I think no matter what agency you are with, there is some patience to be had as well.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, it's just a really interesting issue to me, and it's one that never seems to fully get resolved. But I guess, like you said, you just need to be as strategic as possible about it and do your due diligence when it comes to researching companies, and don't sign anything you're not comfortable with.
Correct.
Let me ask you this question. Let's shift gears a little bit. Another question that I've been asking everybody is writing, like specifically for licensing, trying to sit down and envision where your songs could work licensing wise, or just simply writing music that you're inspired to write. Do you recommend one approach versus the other?
Well, yes and no. I think that, as I said, the good always rises to the top.
Yeah.
And you can't be everything to everyone. So if you do kind of you start training yourself to write a song that's going to have the oohs and the ahs and fit in and the right breaks, you're just going to have a jingle, and it's going to be soulless. So there is that aspect to it. And I do think, if you look at even the HBO shows, there's stuff that, works and that you would never imagine as, this song is going to regularly get licensed. So as I said, there's always the right place at the right time. That said, I do kind of like to push my artists towards writing more towards licensing, because it also gets them out of their comfort zone.
Yeah.
So it does kind of force them to write something that they wouldn't normally write, and they sometimes come up with something great. But my rule is that it has to sound like them. It has to be something that they'd want to do anyway. So if you're an artist and you're forcing yourself to write something happy and you're a big fan of Leonard Cohen, it's not going to work. It's going to come out awful. It's just not going to be you. So regardless, I think the most important of any musician, whether you're doing licensing or just want to be a touring musician or a recording artist, is write. Just keep writing. Write as much as you can. Write a song a day. Write a bad song. Write a good song. Write a crappy song. And really push yourself. And, to put it out in a very broad way is, and I find this particularly with new artists, and it drives me crazy, and I can always tell a new artist when they send me stuff, all the tempos are the same. And so maybe there's some artists out there listening, and they're going to go back to their CDs and say, oh, my God, all every tempos are the same. So I think, if anything, licensing needs different stuff, because there is a certain tempo that's just not interesting, and artists are still getting comfortable with their own songs. So if you push yourself and write something really fast, sometimes it's going to turn out terrible, but sometimes it could be really unique. And, the same thing, play with tempos, play with different instruments or production and layers. And I think regardless of whatever structure of licensing works. As I said, with oohs and ahs or the instrumental breaks, I think even more important is be unique.
Yeah.
Find something really cool and unique, and that's you, because I think that is the most important.
Yeah, that's really cool to hear you say that. I mean, I think probably the last 5 or so guests that I've had on the podcast have more or less kind of said the exact same thing. So it's cool that there's sort of a consensus that, yeah, it's good to sort of keep in mind the context and sort of parameters for licensing. But at the end of the day, if you're not writing from an authentic place, it's probably not going to work.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I said, music supervisors love music, and they listen to it all day. And so that's, once again, the uniqueness will stand out.
Cool. Well, Lisa, I'm going to leave everybody with one more question. This is another question that I've been asking everybody, and in particular, people that have been in this business for a while. And the question is, what are your thoughts about the future of the music business? So in 2017, where we are currently, sort of looking forward, are you optimistic about the future of the music business going forward?
Well, I'm always optimistic, at least about the music business going forward, because I have to be.
Yeah.
But I do think that the music business goes in waves. And it hasn't really been around for a long time, and it's certainly not a Middle Ages, idea. But I do think that things kind of consolidate, and corporations and more like the major labels back in the day would take over, and then they would get too big, and there'd be a bunch of great indie labels springing up. So I do think that it's similar to that right now, where there is a lot of consolidation and people are scrambling. And I think once that area becomes more solidified and resolved in terms of where streaming is going to go, if people are even going to still be buying downloads anymore,
Right.
I think that there will be more cool companies and more creative companies starting up to expand on that. And that's where the opportunities will come. And as I said, it goes in waves. So I think people are determined regardless. And when there's a will, there's always a way, for sure.
Absolutely. I think that's one thing we can all agree on, that music is certainly not going to go away anytime soon, and therefore there will be a business around that in one form or another. Lisa, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to speak with me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Aaron.
And let's tell people where they can go learn more about you. I think you have an open submission policy, don't you? Can people submit music to you if they're interested?
They can. So I will listen to everything that is being sent, but I cannot respond to everyone at all. So at least they'll know that their stuff will get listened to. I'm very, very selective. I'm very snotty. Just send away.
Yeah, because you have to be, I imagine.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
But I'm always looking for good stuff.
Cool. So Optic Noise, the website is optic-noise.com. And again, Lisa, thank you so much for doing this. Have a wonderful day.
All right. Thanks for having me.